Australia has experienced the highest rate of interest rate hikes on record. In fact, there's been 13 interest rate hikes in the past 18 months, taking the cash rate back in May 2022 from 0.1% all the way up to the most recent right in November 2023 to 4.35%. And that might not be the last one. In fact, NAB, the only one of the big four to predict correctly the current interest rate hike to 4.35%, are also predicting that in February there may be another hike to 4.6%. And the reason for these interest rate hikes is to try and curb inflation, stop spending, and to try and reduce demand for property. However, it hasn't really worked out that way. In the past 12 months, Australian dwelling prices have grown by nearly 6%, with some capital cities growing as high as 11% in Perth. Sydney itself has grown by 9% in the past 12 months. So if raising interest rates doesn't really curb buyer demand for property prices, then maybe there are some other factors in play that people haven't really been looking at, and how will they affect property prices in the new year? That's what we're going to break down in this video. Hi, my name is Andy. I'm a Sydney-based buyer's agent and I help busy individuals buy property here in Sydney. So if that sounds like you, smash the subscribe button and follow along. Now, one of the biggest factors that's going to determine house price growth next year is the immigration drive that the current Australian government have been incentivizing so heavily recently. This is obviously a policy that myself and a lot of my friends have benefited from, and a lot more migrants coming into the country for more job opportunities. However, all these extra migrants coming into the country does put higher demand for housing, especially in the major capital cities where most migrants are going to be moving to. Corelogic just done a recent article breakdown on the migration policy of the current government. So let's take a look at that. So Corelogic just released an article there about a week or two ago. You can find this on their website, and they break down 5 things about the migration housing market and things that you should know. So the first one is the housing tenure of migrants. And I'm just going to move this over here. So before 2012, the majority of migrants actually owned the property that they lived in. But we can see that number has progressively gotten down in the years from 2017 to 2021. In those 4 years, only 38% of migrants actually owned the property they lived in. The majority of them rented. So even though there are a large portion of migrants coming into the country, they do tend to stick to the rental market, at least for the first few years, until their permanent residency comes into effect. Part of the reason migration is so high right now is because it was temporarily restricted. So obviously during COVID, people's travel movements were very, very restricted. And we can see here the net overseas arrivals for that period dropped significantly, like went into the negative. And this obviously is causing a bounce back. People who couldn't travel during this time are now coming in. We're seeing this surge up of a net overseas migration of 454,000 people just for this year. And for context, pre-COVID, the decade average of annual net overseas migration was 217,000 people. So it's essentially doubled because of the COVID restrictions and the lack of free movement people could take in that time during COVID. Another interesting part of this report is assuming the average household size of 2.49 people per dwelling in January this year, the year to March would have seen demand for around 182,000 additional dwellings in a year when around 175,000 dwellings were completed. So there's a shortfall there. It may seem like a small number, but that's been compounding over the years. And that shortfall will eventually become a huge, huge number, as we're seeing right now with the lack of housing and the lack of rentals. And number 3, so the COVID migration ban created volatility in the rental market. So a temporary cap on migration may relieve housing demand in the short run, but COVID-19 has already demonstrated the longer term issues with temporary migration caps, because housing demand, which is the movement of people, is more liquid than housing supply, so the construction or the acquisition of new housing. The reopening of international borders created a demand shock, which quickly pushed up rents and worsened an already tight rental market. So if you think about the housing market as like a spring that the COVID restrictions kind of held there for 2 years, and it was just building and building energy. And then finally, when they reopened the borders, it sprung out, and all this extra pressure was put on the housing market and on the rental market. Now, I'll leave a link to the article down below in the video if you want to go and read it for yourself. But essentially what it's highlighting is Australia needs more migrants to keep up with the demand for housing. But if we were to cut off migrants, there would be less pressure on house prices. However, infrastructure and the cost of building would soar because we have less labour there to carry out the work needed. It's a complex issue because if we were to cut off migrants tomorrow, no more migrants into the country, it would ease pressure on house prices, but only in the short term. In the long term, the amount of houses that need to be built each year would not be able to keep up with the underlying demand. And so Australia would actually be in a worse place in the long term if they were to cut off migration. Now, the second factor that I wanted to cover in this video, and I touched on it in the previous point, is the construction worries. And this has been limiting supply into the market for the last number of years. In fact, in the last year, the top 100 builders seen a 23% dip in housing starts, which is the lowest on record since 2003. And this is a table from the Financial Review of the top 20 builders and their starts 2023 compared to 2022. So Metricon at the top as expected, but as you can see here, they are 21% below their starts in 2022. And when you go down through the table, you're seeing an awful lot more red than blue. In fact, there's only six building companies that were in the blue that are doing more starts this year than they were the year previous. And in the top 10, there is only 3 that are in the blue. So 7 in the red. And most of those 7 are in, 20 plus, nearly 20, 20 plus, 20 plus, 20 plus, 20 plus. So they are substantially down. There is this company down here, Hutchies, which is down 65% on their starts this year compared to last year, which is a substantial drop in their starts, and is obviously going to make a massive impact on their profits. And to couple with all of this, builders are only going to build if they see profit in the project. And if there's low demand for housing at the moment because of interest rates and the rising cost of living, are builders going to take on that risk with the higher cost of building materials and labour to carry out the project for a housing type that isn't really in demand or is constrained in demand at the moment because confidence amongst buyers in major capital cities is so low at the moment. So even though builders seem to be finding their feet at the moment, consumer confidence on the demand side of things still seems to be pretty low and pretty subdued, which may impact builders on taking on more projects and exposing themselves to more risk, which makes it very, very difficult to see how these 1.2 million homes are going to be built, how that target is going to be achieved if builders don't want to take on unnecessary risk. And the third point I wanted to talk about in the next year is the low vendor confidence that we've seen all throughout this year. Now, while low vendor confidence isn't necessarily adding to supply side of things, as in it's not adding a brand new home to be bought by a new buyer, it does constrain supply in areas that in the cities where there is no more land to be built upon. When you think of areas in the inner ring, in the inner 15-kilometre ring of most cities like Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, houses there are the supply. There's not going to be huge amounts of apartments built there. So vendors selling homes that they've lived there for 30, 40 years, raised their family, and now they're maybe downsizing. And that creates supply for younger generations to come through and buy a home. Even though it's not a new home, it's still supply on the market. But vendor confidence at the moment is extremely low. This low supply side of things, or low stock options available to buyers, is making it more and more competitive in certain areas, especially here in Sydney in the inner west. It's ultra competitive because there is not so much stock on the market. There's not many options for buyers to choose from. So to wrap it all up, I think the net overseas migration will taper off into next year, which should reduce some of the pressure, especially in the rental market for demand of housing. However, I don't see construction easing off that much more. I do think builders are going to have it tough for the next few years, but we'll see in the coming months and into next year. However, I am skeptical if they can reach the 1.2 million home target. It seems like builders are finding their feet and they are starting to take on more projects. However, they will be very aware, as we've seen many big building companies like Porter Davis went into liquidation last year. They will be very, very aware of their exposure to risk, and they will be monitoring whether consumer confidence is starting to pick up, in which case they may take on more riskier projects. However, this is all speculation and it does depend on where the consumer confidence starts to rank as we get into next year. As consumer confidence starts to pick up, I would imagine builders will start taking on more jobs because they see that demand for his housing is starting to increase. And also vendors who are thinking about selling their home at the moment will be more inclined to sell their home because they think they will get a good and fair price for their property. Again, this is all based upon consumer confidence increasing in 2024. In short, I do see house prices growing quite nicely next year. I do think the demand side of things is far outweighing the supply side of things. And the demand is a lot easier to increase than the supply is. So I don't see the supply side of things being fixed anytime soon. And for that reason, I see house prices growing quite nicely next year. My name is Andy. Thanks for watching.